very much, Sophie, because it's a long way from the chair to the lectern, isn't it? Yeah. It's a long walk, miles away. Yeah. Thanks very much for sticking around to hear what we have to say in this last session. I think it's a real challenge to follow Cassie's presentation there, and you might be wondering, why, if it's a session about imagining the future, why have someone from a research funder to talk about that? Well, I think it does make sense, because I think part of imagining the future, imagining how we can bring communities and research together to achieve the sorts of outcomes that I think Cassie was hinting at in her presentation, funding has to be part of that mix. And to bring about the transformational change that we're all seeking, we need to think about changing the ways in which we fund research in transformational ways as well. And I think you heard this morning from Steve Scott about the new UKRI public engagement strategy. And I'm not going to go through the strategy again, because he explained it really clearly. But I think what I would emphasize to you is just how radical the agenda is that's contained within that strategy. And it's a real challenge for us as an organization to really think about how we can do things differently to bring about the transformation that's described in that strategy. We've mentioned already today, we've talked today about how do we support community networks and meaningful collaborations between communities and researchers, and different ways of funding. You heard some of that this morning, of a real important part to play in that. But there's also a call for, in that strategy, for increased public involvement in priority setting around research. And I think this, for me, this links into to what Cassie's presentation covered about how do we get the imagination and the original ideas of the whole of society to feed into inform research priorities. And I think that's a big challenge for an organization like UKRI. It's a big challenge for other funders, but I think it's also a big challenge for universities. And I think an agenda which universities need actually to seize. How do they talk to and with their local communities about their research and their research priorities? And I think that's something we should all start to think about as a new way of working for the future. There's actually a bit of a movement in research funding at the moment to do things differently, to think about different ways of funding. And I think we heard some fantastic innovative funding approaches earlier on today, but they're all based around a similar paradigm that's about being fair and having an equitable process of expert review in order to identify the projects to fund. But there are problems with that approach. There are factors that can't get taken into account in that approach. It tends to concentrate power in small groups of people, panels that make decisions. And I think there's a lot of thinking that needs to be done about how we can do things differently to actually distribute the power when it comes to allocating research funding. And I think there's lots of funders around the world who are thinking those terms. And I think it fits very strongly to the agenda we've been talking about today. In terms of what Research England is doing to think about this problem of how do we engage research with society, I think I'm going to mention three things that we're doing, just to give you a flavour. And I wouldn't hold up any of these as being hugely innovative, but I think they are, or the aim of them is to move the dial and start to move us into thinking in more engaged and participatory ways. The first one is to support the networks of practice and professionals that are needed to bring about this change. And it was fantastic to hear the session earlier about the various networks, NCUB and NCASE and CAPE and all the others whose names I've forgotten. What's fantastic was to hear about them and how successful they are, but also for me to know that that's something that Research England is very actively supporting. So we have funding relationships in all of those initiatives that you heard about. And that's a really important priority for us to support that infrastructure and networks. The second area I'd like to talk about is a new initiative that we started last year, which was block grant funding for universities specifically for participatory research. Sophie talked about funding experiments. This is very much an experiment from our perspective. This is a different way for us to fund participatory research and public engagement, not focused on projects, but focused on devolving, to use a word that was again used this morning, the decision making about that funding out to universities. It's quite a small programme, just £6 million spread across all the universities in England to greater or lesser extents. But we're really excited to see some of the things that are already coming out of it. We're very pleased to be able to have been able to extend that from 1 year to 3 years following the recent spending settlement. And one of the key questions in my mind is how effective is that for you, and would it be better, or would there be benefits to us increasing the size of that type of funding? We fund universities to a very much greater extent to that, and universities are free, of course, to use that funding for participatory research. But what we're seeing with this new fund is it's bringing a focus, and maybe we should be putting more of our funding into specific earmarked channels like that one. So I'm interested to see how that experiment develops over the coming years. And the third thing I want to talk about, I know I'm getting quite close to my time, the third thing I want to talk about is our support for innovative practice. And this is a kind of advertisement, I guess, for our Research England Development Fund, which is there to support innovation in all areas of university research activity. And I'll just highlight one you've heard about one project from that's supported by the Red Fund already today. That's the CAPE project that you heard about earlier. But I wanted to mention one that's recently been funded and will be starting quite soon, which is a project run by the Universities for Nottingham, which is a partnership of Nottingham and Nottingham Trent University. And it's a project called the Collaboratory, I think you can pronounce it both ways. And this is an 8-year project, £5 million, which will train 50 PhD students and 50 citizen researchers. Those researchers will work together on research problems defined by the communities of Nottingham. So it's a co-production model that's both bringing PhD researchers and citizen researchers together to deliver against the needs of that particular community. We're really interested in that project. We're really interested in what will come out of it, particularly around how it can start to shape the thinking and the training of the next generation of researchers to really think about their research problems in a rather different way in collaboration with their local communities. So that's just an example of the types of thing we can support through the Red Fund, and we're reliant on you to have the innovative ideas that allow us to support that. So I'm going to finish now just with a couple of thoughts from the day that we've had around funding again. And I think there are a number of challenges for us, I think, to think about. One is how do we support the infrastructure and the relationships that are needed to allow engaged research to take place? And what's the balance between supporting that type of activity and supporting projects that deliver specific outcomes? And I think that's a big challenge for all funders to get that balance right. I think there's a really interesting thread developing around place and engagement around place. And I think we really need to think about how much we focus resources into specific areas. And maybe we're not doing enough. Maybe we're spreading our resources too thinly. But of course, the challenge, if you agree that we're spreading resources too thinly, is how do you decide, and what about places that don't get investment? And so I think that's a challenge for us to think about. And then the final challenge, which is related to that, is about how do we deploy the resources we have? Do we spread the resources in a relatively distributed way? Our participatory research fund has done that, spread £6 million over more than 100 universities. Maybe that £6 million would be better invested in one place or in two places. And how do we make those judgments? So those are the real challenges, I think, for us in the future. But we are in a space where we can imagine different ways of funding research and imagine ways of funding research to deliver the outcomes that we want to achieve. Thank you.